Alright, so obviously today we're looking at Baldur's Gate 3. This isn't exactly a simple game to review, at least not in the way I'd like to. So let's get this out of the way up front. I like the game a lot. I highly recommend people play it. However, I do think that there are a lot of issues that have been overlooked because of people's desire for the game to be perfect, backed up by what is actually a great game. Now that that's out of the way, let's try to dive into this as best we can. The organization of my thoughts here will probably be a little less than ideal. A lot of the areas of the game, whether it's technical, story, aesthetic, or gameplay, can all very often bleed into each other and make it hard to separate where each thing should be talked about. So let's start with technical. This is where the game suffers the most. We'll start with the settings since it's the first thing you'll have access to. The gameplay settings are fine. It doesn't give the granularity over the gameplay that some other games give, but it doesn't leave anything out that I would view as a necessity. Next we'll jump to interface here as well, since a lot of these settings sort of border on what I would consider gameplay settings. Again, there isn't a great amount of depth, however there's nothing lacking that I would expect. Passing grade for interface options. Yay! Keybinds are plentiful and none of them seem to be locked, which is always good. It's a big win. Games like this I tend to rebind less since the combat is slower paced, but for those that need or want to, the option is present and easily accessible. This is kind of a subtle jab at Armored Core, but we'll touch more on that later next week most likely. As far as graphic settings, there's nothing I don't expect to see here. Would it be fun to have ray tracing? Yeah, it would. Would it run well? Probably not, but it would still be fun to see what you can get the game to look like. It's not really a big issue for me that it's not here. Petty gripes aside, I like that a lot of the settings show you images for different settings so you know what you are changing. This can help you decide what you want to change to optimize your performance while having the game look nice in ways that make the game the most enjoyable for you, and this really helps when you're someone that doesn't have a lot of experience or a lot of knowledge about what each of these settings do. As far as audio goes, I love the amount of sliders the game has. I'm very picky about what volume certain things are at, and while it's passable to have games with 3 sliders, I'd like to think we should be moving beyond that. Oftentimes certain overworld dialogue can be drowned out, but dialogue in cutscenes is fine. Lowering the world volumes or raising the voice in a 3-slider system leaves people shouting at you in cutscenes or with an ominous quiet looming over everything else. Being able to raise chatter or crowd dialogue or lower everything else around it adds a great amount of customizability to the audio. The accessibility menu seems confusing to me. There are repeat settings, like nudity as well as camera and audio options, all of which were already in gameplay or audio. Maybe these are helpful for people to have in separate accessibility menus, but it seems odd to duplicate the settings. It almost feels like fluff to make it seem like there are more accessibility settings than there really are. It feels like this may be lacking. Unfortunately, I don't feel I'm the best person to judge what should or should not be in accessibility menus. On to the rest, and unfortunately worst part of the technical review. There isn't really a clean place to start here, so let's just go with the dialogue. Dialogue seems to break a lot. This can sometimes be characters repeating what appears to be one-time only dialogues. Other times it's characters thinking you've done something you absolutely haven't done. This specifically happened a lot to me in Act 3. If I had to guess, I would think this is because of the amount of dialogue markers or chains throughout the game that are starting to come together, can cause some conflicts, or things are not mapping properly, or maybe they forgot to say, hey, if this is set, you know, this happens. While I can understand how this may happen, it doesn't make it any less frustrating. For example, when Gale accuses me of making deals with not-so-nice people I never made. In fact, I did the exact opposite, and he was with me when I didn't do the thing he's accusing me of. Speaking of ambitious dialogue, verticality is another thing this game is excited to show off, especially in Act 3, but fails to deliver on. This adds for really fun and seamless exploration on environments, however it also brings along a camera system that is completely unprepared for the job. Climbing winding staircases up towers is an almost insurmountable task at times since the floor above doesn't usually load until you near the very top of the staircase that connects to it. This is, like many flaws with the game, for an understandable reason. You need to see where you are going. Unfortunately, the game does not have a good solution to that. These situations are made far worse when fighting on 2 or more levels of terrain, especially when those levels are stacked on top of each other, for example, inside a building. The floor above will often be invisible until you are high enough up on the stairs, making it very difficult to fight upwards as you can't see enemies or terrain above you. This felt most problematic for me in the fireworks shop in Act 3. How do I say speaking of ambitious X without saying speaking of ambitious? Anyway, cutscenes and camera angles. There are frequent issues with camera angles during dialogue and cutscenes. I'm not sure how this happened, but it happens a lot. The Bard in Act 1, blocked by either a tree or a pillar the entire time. There are times where I get to see the beautiful side or back of a character while they tell me something important, and I can't help but think about how this all got missed. Some of it I can maybe chalk up to how you approach them, where exactly your character is standing when you interact and start dialogue, but many of the issues seem to happen during entirely scripted scenes where the angle of approach and where you start the conversation from shouldn't matter. While this doesn't impact the gameplay, story, or one's ability to enjoy those two things, it does seem incredibly odd, the frequency with which I'm encountering these issues. Camping! The only thing here I can really bring up is auto rest. The way the camp supplies are selected is terrible. It doesn't seem to auto-split items, which is weird and can cause you to waste all of your camp supplies if you aren't paying attention, because it won't unstack them. It doesn't seem to auto-split items, which is weird and can cause you to waste all of your camp supplies if you aren't paying attention. As far as the technical department goes, I think that's all we've got today, so on to gameplay. The overall gameplay is good to great. It takes a system a lot of us know and many of us love, and adapts it to a video game format. I can't help but think of the potential VTT use for something like this. As far as balance goes, it's somewhat hard to discuss as this is based off of D&D 5e, which is something made by Wizards of the Coast and not Larian. That said, the changes they've made make the game feel more enjoyable for this sort of setting. By setting, I mean the video game media instead of a tabletop medium. Some of those are things like including the often homebrewed potions, take a bonus action to drink. Nothing feels worse than losing a full round to drink a potion, only to be hit and then need another potion next round. There is also the 2 short rests per day. While I've seen some people say they don't like this, for me personally, I feel it's a very strong addition to the game and helps the game balance encounter and story pacing. There are some issues here, however. I don't think any of them really have to do with the numbers supporting the game, including those that Larian decided to make changes to. The issues I have are more with the supporting gameplay mechanics, things like torches. They replace your offhand weapon and can often lead to situations where you lose a shield or a second weapon when clicking the torch button again to put the torch away. Since I often have my front line carrying the torch, they tend to be frequently impacted by the missing shield scenario where they've now lost AC. There is also the lack of formations. This is another really odd one to me. I thought Larian had formations in Divinity Original Sin 2, and most games in the genre also have formations as sort of a staple in the format. This leads to a lot of situations where your group moves around in ways that feel suboptimal or requiring you to spend a lot of time prior to combat to make sure everyone is spaced properly by individually moving and separating them from the group. Lastly, my big complaint here is items. My issues with the items is the tagging system. This is something that frustrates me infinitely whenever I see it, and seeing it here breaks my heart. I felt like Larian had some of the better loot sorting in Divinity Original Sin 2, and in some ways it feels like a step has been taken backwards here. There's so much loot that feels like it could be useful, but it shares the same item tags as things like rags and broken plates. Most of the items that feel like they could be useful end up being useless. This makes it even more frustrating when you find out that some of them are very useful, even while they are close in similarity to items that were useless. Things like infernal iron and components for multi-part combining weapons all appear as junk. This makes me want to hold on to things like ingots and gems, as who knows, I may need them later, especially when I'm thinking about things like spell components for stronger spells or the ability to possibly make your own equipment. There is definitely a missed opportunity either with item tagging or using items that are on the surface insignificant for certain contextual acts. Taking a quick break from the heavier parts of the review, the senses. By that I'm trying to be fun with how I say the look and sound of the game. In the CRPG space, these are the most detailed characters you will be able to find. The entire presentation of the places you explore is better overall than you can find in other similar games. The animations for dialogue and cutscenes are something that I've been seeing more of in the CRPG space, and it's done in its best and at its most often here. The game also does a great job with these spells and a lot of the enemies and environment design. A majority of the spells, those utilized in combat anyway, all bring with them a great feel. Casting is a sheer pleasure with the light shows you can put on display, especially as each higher level spell becomes only more spectacular. The level or set design is generally a wonder to behold, especially in Act 3 when you get this amazing crowded city with everything stacked on top of each other. I think the weakest area for me was the Moonrise Towers, though you could argue that this makes sense since the area is supposed to be a place where people are lost in the darkness. It's not something I personally think holds up, but at the risk of strawmanning it, I won't really tear it all the way down. The music is wonderful, though at times I found the music to be very reminiscent of Divinity Original Sin 2. While definitely not a bad thing for me, maybe a more unique sound would be more fitting. though it's possible it is more unique than I'm giving it credit, or that it's tied to or inspired by other D&D settings and possibly the earlier Baldur's Gate games. The voice acting is excellently delivered. The issues here are not of the voice actors making. While maybe this belongs in the technical portion, it does appear that there are issues with awkwardly long pauses, usually between characters, but sometimes between follow-up lines from the same characters. Finally, let's jump to the plot and any thickening it may have. And it's a thick plot, that's for sure. There is a lot going on here, and most, if not all of it, is good. There are cliches in a lot of places, but they all feel well done and enjoyable to trot through. There are also several small subversions over the course of the main story that don't meaningfully change anything, but add a level of context that makes you feel like these were great discoveries that are being made. One area where I feel I've come into contrast with many people is the amount of ways the story can be approached. Mayhaps it's my simple brain boiling it all down and saying, well, the ends are similar, so basically all the same. But I feel like a lot of the options or choice you are presented with is just an illusion. When I think of games with a lot of choice, I'm looking to things like Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous. Do I want this to be Wrath of the Righteous? No, not really. I think it was a mostly adequate story to tell with all of the linearity that was included, but I want to make sure I call this out as I feel it's undue praise that has been sung quite a bit. I'm happy to be called out if you disagree. I am a little afraid of the replayability for the game, however, at least at the story level. I think most of the replayability will come in at the optimization and creating fun characters area. I think that's great. Once I've had time to sit and think on it, I will probably end up creating some fun parties, some fun characters, though it may be hard to use hirelings to make really ridiculous parties. I hate moving away from the companions the game provides you with. Speaking of those companions, they're great. Well, Lae'zel is kind of iffy, but she grows on you until, well, at least for me. Until X, at least for me. Every character feels deep and rewarding to interact with in their own way. The way the characters open up, change, or present themselves over time in a way that feels natural and appropriate for who the character is. This makes some of the characters frustrating and annoying to deal with. In some cases, I write them off completely for a natural playthrough. That said, I don't write them off because they're poorly made. I write them off as companions because of how well done they are. It makes me want to replay the game to get a certain companion I didn't have access to, though I'm afraid of what I may need to do to get them. The conclusion of each companion arc also feels very rewarding and well done, though, as hinted, I have not done Lae'zel's. I got Lae'zel's quest that I was less than enthused to finish, and something happened where she wasn't around to bother me about it for most of Act 3 anyway. All of this to say, this is a good game. It's a really good game. It may even be a great game. It is a CRPG that doesn't have the depth that I feel a lot of other CRPGs do. However, what it lacks there, it makes up for in presentation and flair. To me, that isn't the most important thing, but I definitely think it will get people in the door. Once everyone gets inside, some of them may realize this is a genre that they like a lot, and maybe we can have some resurgence of, again, what I think is one of the greatest genres in gaming. If anyone has thoughts about trying out CRPGs but has been too afraid by lots of unvoiced dialogue or unfamiliar and cumbersome systems, this is a great first step, and I recommend you take it. Regardless of what's next, Larian's games have grown so much game to game that whether it's another D&D title, Divinity title, or something new altogether, I'll be here waiting, excited to jump into whatever they've created. As always, thank you so much for watching. Let me know your thoughts on Baldur's Gate 3 or anything I mentioned in the video. I'll see you next time.